So as I was reflecting on it, at first I was so excited because I'm like, he finally handed in that project I've been waiting for. And I felt like such a superstar teacher that I finally reached this student. And then I started reading it and it dawned on me that this was the ChatGPT that people were talking about. So then I just had this profound sense of like, how is this going to impact my classroom going forward? How is this going to affect the education system going forward? And I was thinking full existential crisis mode, like, how is this going to affect humanity going forward? So I marched down to my principal's office at the time and I was like, we got to do something. I had no idea what we were to do about this technology. I didn't really understand it at all, but I felt this sense of urgency. And I think that was such an important step for me, is just this urgency that we have to do something. I had no idea what that something was, but I felt compelled to act in some way.
I heard somebody say recently that the two most important subjects in education right now, in K-12 education, should be philosophy and biology when it comes to understanding AI and its impact on us. Today's guest, Marcus Blair, has a background in philosophy. He teaches philosophy at a high school in school district 67 in the Okanagan, and he has been a wonderful addition to my network for sure in terms of a practical approach to AI and somebody who is extremely thoughtful in the work that he's doing. And it's been wonderful to see and to connect with Marcus. He's shared with my students. I know I've connected him with many people in my network to continue to share many of his approaches to AI, in particular, some of the way he's handled his assignments of recently, embedding in assessment scales to the work that he does in AI assessment approaches. More importantly than all of that, it's just been a delight to hear him think out loud about the struggles that he has as he thinks about AI, as many of us do, but in a way that, coming from that philosophical background, can apply the real issues around ethics and virtue that I think is the thing that most of us are looking for. We're trying to approach this in that kind of an ethical manner, and having a background in philosophy and thinking the way that Marcus does is truly a guidepost for us as we want to think about what this means for our students and for our schools. Very excited today to be able to introduce you. If you don't know Marcus already, he'll be a great addition to your network, and I know you'll enjoy his thoughts as he shares a lot of his personal journey and practical examples of how AI is impacting him and his students and his school district. So Marcus, I'll start you off with, I don't know if it's not even a tough question, but we're just diving right in. Sometimes these are slow rolls, but I'm going to go right to it for you. And this isn't that long ago, but what was your first reaction when you discovered generative AI and heard about it and played with it?
My first reaction when I actually discovered it was, I think I was just browsing on Reddit, and I noticed a couple kind of news stories about how people were using this new technology to create almost new lyrics representing some sort of singer's style, like new Elvis songs, new Eminem raps for the chemistry notes and things like that. So it was actually a curious reaction. I didn't honestly take it too seriously. It wasn't until I started reading some news articles how students were actually using this ChatGPT to create their essays that I started really thinking about it. But even then, I felt like it was just it was an American problem at that point. It hadn't really crossed the threshold into Summerland, so I wasn't really stressing about it. Not till it entered my classroom for the first time, and then that curiosity transformed quickly into fear. I had a student who struggled to get assignments, and very bright kid, and he handed in this assignment, and it was so good in some ways. The writing was so clean, but there was just something off about it. So as I was reflecting on it, at first I was so excited because I'm like, he finally handed in that project I've been waiting for. And I felt like such a superstar teacher that I finally reached this student. And then I started reading it and it dawned on me that this was the ChatGPT that people were talking about. So then I just had this profound sense of like, how is this going to impact my classroom going forward? How is this going to affect the education system going forward? And I was thinking full existential crisis mode, like, how is this going to affect humanity going forward? So I marched down to my principal's office at the time and I was like, we got to do something. I had no idea what we were to do about this technology. I didn't really understand it at all, but I felt this sense of urgency. And I think that was such an important step for me, is just this urgency that we have to do something. I had no idea what that something was, but I felt compelled to act in some way.
And when you say existential, sometimes maybe I don't know if you intended to position that as an overreaction, but I don't know that it even is overreaction. I think actually is true. And even though those early days of AI, you could still see, and again, we're going back now, not even November 2022, we are 3.5, just over 3 years into this. And as much as they've evolved, the same sort of threat exists. And so I don't think you were wrong in viewing that. But I also think too, this notion of curiosity and saying we have to do something, but I don't know what it is. I think that's absolutely the mindset that we have to have. And to be honest with you, as much as I've been doing this, as much as you have been doing this in your own classroom, I'm not 100%. I know I haven't solved all the issues. I know I haven't quite figured it all out. And I'm still trying to figure out what is it that we're going to do. I feel like we are doing some things, but there's still just more and more questions that are continuing to emerge.
Yeah, like the first thing I ever wrote, and I'm an avid blogger, the first thing I ever wrote on the subject was a blog post titled "A Grave New World, My Most Pessimistic Thoughts on AI." And I wrote a lot of things about how our purpose could be usurped by Gen AI. And I'm like, for a while there afterwards, I thought, oh, how could I be so wrong? But like you say, maybe I'm not wrong. It's just, these are the choices we make as a society, is how do we approach this technology? How do we navigate it? How do we employ it in a responsible and ethical way? So nobody knows all ends. I don't know what the world's going to look like in 50 years, 20 years, 100 years. So who knows? Maybe it will be a negative thing by then, but it's hard to say. So I still have that tinges of dread on occasion.
Just for people who don't know, and again, into this podcast, I will have already introduced you, so you don't need to go into all the details, but just again, for context, for people who are picking it up wherever, is it not true that you have you don't teach philosophy, but you have a bit of a philosophy background, if I'm not mistaken?
It's actually the opposite. I teach philosophy, and it's
okay.
I teach full blocks of it, and I have a bit of a philosophy background. I took some coursework. I have a fascination with it, so I read a lot.
Yeah.
But no, I believe I'm the only one who teaches it in my district. Complete happenstance. But essentially, they needed a philosophy teacher. They pulled the students one year, and they said, what do you want to take as a humanities course? And 60 kids said, I want to take philosophy. And our school at that time had nobody to teach philosophy, and I had no job. So I said, you know what, I can teach philosophy. And I was a bit overly confident. So I did a lot of research in the off season, read a lot of philosophy books, and I always had a fascination with it. And that led me to teaching philosophy every year since. So this is probably my 7th or 8th year of teaching philosophy.
And listen, I've heard, I'm sure you have too, about the importance of that mindset and discipline in this conversation. So maybe just talk a little bit about how and why philosophy is a really important discipline, way of thinking when it comes to the AI conversation.
In terms of the AI conversation, a lot of what philosophy offers me is a lot of clarity in my thinking, like places where I can ground my insights, my opinions, my strategies, and my positions on AI. So something like the other day, we're studying Descartes, so a philosopher who's been dead for 400 odd years. And what we talked about is how he talks a lot about how you can't put 100% trust in your senses. So it's just something with AI now and how pervasive it's become on social media, where there's stats show that 71% of images are either AI generated or AI altered in some way. It gives us some clarity on, you know what, we got to approach social media kind of like Descartes approached the world, that we can't necessarily trust what we see. We have to have other ways to critically evaluate the media in front of us nowadays. Same goes for video. And then when it comes to ethics, that's helped me immensely in providing me with my strategies on how I want to approach Gen AI in my own classroom. So sometimes I take the utilitarian approach and I really think, what stance, how could I benefit the most people, most students through my different strategies in my class? When it comes to ethics, sometimes I take a virtue ethics approach as well and try to think, especially when it comes to misusing AI, I try to think, how can I teach students not to misuse AI? And part of that is just really grounding them in virtue ethics. That's not about not wanting them to misuse AI.
That's
It's
right.
more about not wanting them to misuse AI. And I think that makes all the difference because one involves me policing it, which is really a Herculean task. It's Sisyphean. It's not going to really, it's not going to work. It's not sustainable. But when they choose not to misuse it, I think that's a lot more sustainable, a lot more rewarding, and it creates more of a positive classroom environment.
And I think that I've seen the districts that I've worked with really try to approach the whole notion of academic integrity with a different lens, not the, all right, so this is about kids cheating and how we stop them from cheating and how we catch them from cheating. And it's like, all right, that's part of it, but really diving into what does it mean to be a person of integrity? What does that actually mean? Right. And I think, yeah, you accept the fact that you're working with teenagers. We know their brains aren't developed. We know it's difficult at times to build in intrinsic kinds of motivations and ideas, but that doesn't mean we don't try to do it. Because I think what is proven is that even the work that you're doing today, and even if you don't see the fruit of it within the semester or so that you have those students, it might be 5 years from now that they'll say, Mr. Blair talked about this in my philosophy class in high school. And I think that's just something we have to just hold on to and not give up this conversation that says that's our job. So if all we're going to play is policing, that's just, first of all, I'm not interested in that just at all. I don't want it. It doesn't, and I know at times, yeah, you're forced into it, but I do think I want to build on that a little bit around maybe things that you have seen and moments that you've experienced since you've adopted a more sort of open use of AI for yourself and your students that would, maybe influence you in terms of either hopeful things like, wow, that was really interesting and useful. And I think I got that little piece a kid got right. Or maybe even otherwise, yeah, no, we tried something and that certainly wasn't what we want to do. So I'm just wondering if there's some moments you can point to in the last couple of years that would informed your practice and your beliefs of where you are today.
Yeah, there's definitely a couple moments for sure. And some of them are positive and some of them are, I guess they could be seen as negative. I think the one moment was just a couple weeks ago. I was speaking to a student who I've taught a few times, and she's heard me talk about different AI technologies, different ways to employ it, different ways to leverage it, but also the risk of misusing it too, and the risks on that could undermine student learning. And then I bumped into her in the hall, and she was just telling me how she had started leveraging Notebook LLM to help her study for, I think it's biology or chemistry or one of those courses. And just how it has aided her in understanding, because she always said, I learned a little different. So she actually used it to transform her notes into podcasts. And then when she was on her commute to school or when she was at the gym, she actually played these podcasts. It helped her learn. And it made me think even more that there's so many spaces where we could integrate this technology, where we could enrich student learning. And it's also preparing our students they're going to enter university when they'll be dealing with a lot of different pressures and a lot of different adversity in their life, and they'll need to find ways to study, ways to be successful. And for some of them, generative AI could be that way.
Yeah. And I just think those are just those moments of, all right, so let's talk about the idea of AI as an assistant, as a helper kind of thing, and what that looks like. And there's a student that's figured that out in her way, right? And I think that's the part that's so powerful is that may not be everybody's way. Maybe everybody doesn't want to listen to a podcast, but for some kids, that happens to be the way. So maybe just, again, we'll back up a little bit and talk what does AI look like in your classroom? So how is it presented to kids? What sort of the parameters have you given them? All those kind of things.
Yeah, it's a day one sort of deal. So how it looks in my class is I have a couple posters on my wall that actually speak about different levels of integration from no AI permitted to using AI as a feedback helper. using it as an idea starter and using it as a work partner. So I have posters that articulate that. And then I actually start the course by going over my course outline. And within the course outline is a couple of paragraphs that explain those different levels of integration. And I think something I've added this semester has been a student Gen AI agreement, where what I do is I actually read over, it's like a contract in a way, where it reads over completely my position on Gen AI, how I believe it can be a tool to enrich their learning when it's used properly, responsibly, but it can also do the opposite and undermine their learning as well. So they learn my expectations. They learn about how it'll work logistically in my classroom. And then at the very bottom, they actually sign and they date it. So it becomes somewhat of a sign of their integrity, and it becomes more of a symbolic gesture. I doubt it's going to be a binding in court sort of thing. Then pragmatically, how does it look in my classroom is each of my projects have an AI stamp on them. So many of them have an AI stamp that says no AI permitted. So if me as the teacher have decided that Gen AI could probably undermine my intended learning outcomes, what I do is I just tell them right away, full transparency, AI will not be used for this project. And so far this semester, so far this year, that has worked pretty well. Whereas other projects have different stamps, whether it's a feedback helper, a work partner. And then what that means is they can actually leverage AI for that specific learning task. So for instance, I did a project in philosophy class where they had to essentially, it was this situation where basically we pretended 100 strangers crash landed onto an island into a state of nature. And then what students had to do is they had to come up with their own perspective on what would happen on that island. So some of them leveraged AI to help them understand different philosophers' perspectives on the matter. Some of them leveraged AI to create images to help them communicate their own stats. And some students actually leveraged AI with my permission to edit their punctuation because I wasn't explicitly assessing them on their level of punctuation for this specific task, that I allowed that level of cognitive offloading so then they could focus on more the deep critical thinking, deep analysis. And then what I have them do and what I have them do whenever I allow them to leverage AI is I have a QR code on the assignment that connects to an AI disclosure form. So then what students do is they take 30 seconds, 40 seconds, and they connect to this QR code to this form, they fill it out, and it completely discloses full transparency how they leveraged Gen AI for that project. So that way they learn how to use it in a responsible manner. They know they had my permission and they get used to this idea of AI disclosure, which I know is becoming much more commonplace in both universities and the working world. So I've
Yep.
heard of accounting firms, law offices are mandating disclosure.
Yeah. And I think the one thing you said that I think is really powerful, people talk a lot about cognitive offloading, always in a negative sense. Like we should not do cognitive offloading. But I think the way you framed it, it says like sometimes when a student is faced with a myriad of cognitive tasks, they may, and yes, you could argue, well, part of learning is being able to make a decision and saying, this, I'm not going to attend to this right now, but I want to attend to that. But I think there's a place where you can say, I want you to use this to offload this so that you can do that. And so I think too, there's something, I think what I hear in many of those cases is you've given the kids some confidence then because they're not struggling with a thing that I didn't really want you to struggle with that. How often does that happen, right? A kid does an assignment or project and they get hung up on something that you really didn't need them to get hung up on, but they did. But it's also, it had to get done in some respects because you couldn't do that thing. You had to do A before you do B. So I just think there's, I like the intention, I guess, is what you're pointing to. So I don't even know if you can follow that up with maybe an example of what that could look like in a very specific, practical way.
Yeah, for me, this idea, and that was something I had to get over in terms of allowing some level of cognitive offloading, but in a very strategic way. So for instance, I have this project in social justice where students have to conduct an evaluation of a commemoration controversy. So what they do is they look at a controversial figure from history, whether it's a John A. Macdonald, a Thomas Jefferson, or something like that. And they used to spend a lot of time researching that figure. And then they would write a report on their historical legacy. And only then would they actually get into the ethical judgment part, which was really the learning outcome. It was the standard I'm assessing.
Right.
What I found is they spent so much time doing the research, which is an important skill, and writing this report that they would actually only dedicate probably just a few minutes to the actual ethical judgment. So the last time I did this project is I decided to have students work in groups for the report part. So they were in groups, they researched together, they shared their research, they had to track all their sources. And then what I allowed them to do is use Gen AI, practice it to create a coherent report that their group could share. But then individually, they would have to write an ethical judgment of that commemoration, that historical figures commemoration, and decide whether that statue should stay standing, should it be revised with a slightly altered plaque, or should it be taken down? And the students had to do that without any aid of Gen AI. They had to come in and write it in more of an in-class write sort of atmosphere. But then they did such a better job, a richer job,
Okay.
and more of a critical thinking aspect. And that's what I wanted to stress with this project. Whereas before they spent so much time trying to refine the report, clean up the punctuation, make it thorough as well paragraphed, which are surely important skills. But for this project, they didn't have to be.
Yeah, no, that's a great example. One of the big, I don't know, yeah, it is a big question, I would say, for educators is, first of all, what long-standing, time immemorial types of teaching approaches are still not only relevant, but are useful and helpful in 2026 as we think about the impact of AI. And then, well, let's stop there because I do think there might be, maybe there's some new things, maybe not. But let's look at, you're a teacher that, and so the teachers that say, like, even some of your early reaction around this is going to really disrupt and so forth. Okay. But I don't know if you have that chance to say, but there's things that I've done that I've always done that I know they're right. They're helping kids learn. They're effective pedagogical practices that remain not just important in today's age, but they've actually been supportive in the way you've used AI. In other words, for example, if a teacher would say kids need to learn how to write an essay, and again, we can have that debate, but that may not, and again, I don't define, that's not a pedagogical practice. That's an outcome but like something like that, you could say that maybe has to change. But what doesn't have to change and shouldn't change and has maybe been really useful in your teaching in the last few years?
Honestly, what's been very helpful is before I got into this AI conversation, I spent a lot of time with assessment and specifically standards based assessment. So I found that has served me really well in this kind of new era with Gen AI because it's provided me with a lot of clarity on what are the specific standards I'm assessing for any given project. And when I understand those standards, I understand the different levels of learning that students can demonstrate via that standard, different levels of proficiency. I can strategically integrate Gen AI as a means to hopefully enhance their understanding of those standards. But I can also be aware of where it might undermine the development of any specific standard. So, what I mean by that is for English language arts. So, when I'm assessing a student's level of clarity in their writing, their use of conventions, obviously editing with a Gen AI tool would completely undermine my learning intention. So, for situations, if I'm marking them on their punctuation, that's a situation where I wouldn't allow them to leverage Gen AI. So I find standard, it just provides me so much clarity on what am I trying to accomplish with this project. I always break projects down into the different standards. And I view projects as I'm not marking the project, marking the projects as an expression of different skills. So I found that has been extremely helpful.
And conversely, and maybe you can speak to not only your own experience, but perhaps colleagues as you've had conversations, what practices have been challenged? You might say the standards-based grading approach has been challenged too. You talked about how that can undermine, but, and I don't say this, I don't want to set this up as a question to reveal, oh, they haven't updated their practice. They're outdated. I empathize with teachers who say, here's a thing that I think is really important, an approach that AI is really giving me a hard time. So what's been the challenging parts that might be still seen as these are actually good things, but it's really hard to do in the age of AI?
Yeah, I think one, and The one thing that's been a challenge for everyone is just there's so much emphasis on the learning product. And very pragmatically so, is that is the final thing you can evaluate and assess. So for me, it's been like not just talking about the learning process being important, but actually living that in my classroom. A lot of teachers have made that transition. It's like before I would have students write essays. And I spoke about the learning process like it was important, but I never really put that much emphasis on it in my classroom. We went through the steps as a class, but again, I wasn't really spending as much time. I wasn't breaking them down as much as I ought to. But lately, with this onset of Gen AI, I still have students in certain classes write essays. What I've done is instead of focusing on just that final product, I've really been breaking down the learning process so meticulously. So instead of just saying, I'm assigning an essay, here's these steps you should probably go through, what we do is we go through them together. So what we do is we'll annotate a text as a class. We'll take those annotations, we'll put them in some sort of graphic organizer. And from there, we'll transform that into a thesis. And step by step, I'm actually walking around connecting with all the students in my class to see how they're doing with each of these steps. So then once they have their thesis, I have them show it to me. I give them the thumbs up. Then what they do is they write topic sentences for their paragraphs. And then again, they call me over. I give them the thumbs up again. I look at it. And then they find some sources to support those topic sentences. And then they start writing a draft. So it's like step by step, I'm making these tangible observations as part of this formative assessment process before I get to a product. And then I'm so much more confident in not just the authenticity of that final product, but the quality of it too. Because I've seen them go through these important steps and I put so much emphasis that they are starting to believe they're important too. Rather than just something I say is an aside or have an assignment, I'm really breaking it down day by day for students. And I think it's paying dividends. It's made me a much better teacher. And I think it's resulting in stronger work too. Whereas it used to be the case when you're just looking at the product, there's just so much anxiety that maybe they generate it using AI, but the truth is you can't generate a process. It's
Right.
not Yale.
And that description makes me wonder if the precious time you have in class is now that you're doing a lot more assessment in class. So that makes me wonder about, has it in any way potentially reduced not only the homework that you might assign, but maybe even the homework that you do, because they're using, again, I appreciate the fact that you've created these guidelines and parameters, and it sounds like kids are generally staying within the guardrails that you put up. But I wonder if there's been any sort of shift in whether it's homework or just even your own workload because of how much time you're spending in class doing these kinds of assessments. And maybe the answer is no, it hasn't, but I'm just curious.
No, I think it has for them. I'm a teacher. I don't put much emphasis on homework, and I certainly don't anymore. Is I find it is more authentic, and it always was. That's the truth. Is a lot of students could always go home and they might have two parents with a lot of time and a lot of education, a certain domain who could really help them out too. So there was no guarantee before that the work students brought home was going to be authentically theirs anyway. But nowadays it's true. I really don't put much, I don't know if trust is the right word, but I definitely have students spend more time in class getting stuff done. And I found that's been very helpful is in terms of work completion, I'm more on top of how they're doing in the class too. Because when I break things down step by step, I'm fully aware of where they're at for any given project. I'm like, oh, I know you're in the brainstorming phase. Next, we'll go to the drafting. So I know exactly where they're at. So I don't need them to do homework. We come up with a strategy for when they can hit that next stage in their learning. So yeah, homework is not something I want my students to do. I want them to, if they're going to have some more free time, I want them to enjoy life. I want them to read books. I want them to watch documentaries. I want them to play sports and have passions. I don't need them to be doing schoolwork at home.
And again, I'm sure that you have a lot of colleagues who think the same, but there's always those that aren't quite as open to students' lives outside of classroom. But again, we'll save that for another conversation. No, I appreciate all of that. And again, you've been a great resource for me in terms of pointing to teachers who are trying to figure this out in ways and finding some success. And so I appreciate that. When you think though, whether it's, and again, I don't want to focus the entire conversation on AI. I just think about in your career when you look back at what you've been able to do at this point? And I know it's not something that many educators do very often, is look back and go, oh, that was something I'm really proud of. But what if you could look at something and say, yeah, that's what I'm really proud of in terms of the work that you've been able to do, whether it's in your district or in other organizations as well. So I don't know if you've got a thing that you feel really proud about that you've done.
Honestly, when it comes down to it, I'm proud of my district and that we're a small district. We're Summerland, BC, Penticton, BC. So there's not a lot of personnel compared to those bigger districts. But I feel like we are taking maybe not the lead, but we are taking a lead in a lot of this work. And it comes from the top. It comes from Todd Manuel, our superintendent, has put such an early emphasis on this work that we've been so committed to building capacity in every step of the way, every level of the district, from the district administrators to the school administrators to teachers to the educational assistants and the support staff. We put so much work into building people's capacities and also providing forums for people to have dialogue, to share their anxieties, share their perspectives on it as well. We're not pushing a certain narrative like you have to buy into this. It's not like that. Really, it's like there's an urgency. We got to do something. So let's just come together and discuss some strategies of what we need to be doing. So I'm so proud to be part of that work in this district.
And yeah, and I concur with all that you're saying. And I think the whole approach, even if we get back to the AI conversation, the whole approach with AI of being curious and vulnerable and saying, we don't know all the answers, but we're going to work together. I think back to the podcast I did with Todd when he had to think about closing schools. And that was not an easy conversation. And even the way he approached that, which was like, I don't know exactly what the answer is here, but let's come together at this. And like that notion of collaboration, but not just collaboration in a, because sometimes that can be a little bit superficial, and the teachers they can sniff it a mile away when they ask for your insight, but they just go ahead and do the thing they were going to do anyways. That is a very fast way to lose trust, but that's not at all the way that Todd has approached that in this work as well, because he's been very open about saying, we know what we know, but we also don't know what we don't know, and we want to figure out how to fill those gaps. So yeah, there's something culturally really powerful about that kind of a leadership approach, which isn't, oftentimes people don't want that. They want a certainty of, I know what we're going to do. We're going to do this and this. And again, it's not to say that's a bad way of approaching it, but I know that's not the way that things work in Penticton. So no, I appreciate that. As you think about even your role, you've taken on some leadership roles and so forth. And again, I always like to tease out in this podcast this notion of leadership and challenges that you might have faced and wrestling with something. So what maybe comes to mind when you think of a leadership challenge, either as a teacher or a teacher leader or whatever other capacity you're thinking of?
Yeah, and it's a challenge that is ongoing. It's not a challenge that really has come to completion. But this notion of finding common ground. The thing about Gen AI is it's such a contentious, polarizing technology. So my early attempts to establish dialogue with my colleagues from across the district, my colleagues in my school, like I don't know if I was fully ready for how such an emotional response people are going to have to this technology. So early on, I was like, where do we even start? This technology has a lot of baggage. It is environmental baggage. It is sociological baggage. It is psychological baggage. It is political baggage now. So we had to find a common ground, just a productive kind of stable ground where we could get our conversations kind of growing. And what I found is just starting by talking about ethics, talking about the things we're concerned about. And I think we all shared that. We all shared concerns about it. So I think getting those on the table. So for me, that was a challenge. It still is, like finding entry points for everybody, regardless of their perspective. And I think all perspectives are valid, honestly. There's a lot of unanswered questions with this, and it is so profoundly powerful that it's hard to know how people are going to use it for good or potentially use it for the opposite.
Yeah. And again, with everything still up in the air, and the more you read about it, the more you read it, the scales could be tipped to go one way or the other very easily, depending. And a lot of it is totally outside of our control for sure. But no, I appreciate that. And again, I do think this represents an opportunity for school districts to say, hey, none of us have all the answers. Bring your concerns, bring your fears, bring all those things. Let's talk about them. We're going to shy away from that just because I might share a different perspective than you are, which isn't always something that we are very good at as a society. These are things that make us pretty polarized, as we could see in a political escape as well. So I hold out hope for this particular conversation to, if we get it right, to spill into some of these other areas of our society so that we can start having better conversations with people and not shut everything down. But as we wind down our time, I'm always asking people to name one person that they're grateful for. Could be a mentor, could be a colleague next door, could be just a random person. So even if it's somebody that you just thought of today because you had some interaction with them today. So one person that you're really grateful for in the education.
Honestly, I'm grateful for Todd Manuel. Like he's the superintendent of my district, but it's not always the case that people in that office get to know all their staff. But for me early on, he didn't just know my name, but he knew my work. And he put a lot of belief in, as a young teacher, having your superintendent not just know your name, but really interested in the things you do. Like he came and he observed me teach one day. It was a couple of years ago when Gen AI was first bursting on the scene. He sent me an email just saying he wanted to sit down, have a conversation about Gen AI and just hear my thoughts on it. He knew I was interested in different conversations, different ethical topics, things like that, and philosophy. So him and actually it was Myron Duick. He was a former administrator of mine. He's a consultant. We sat down. We just talked about Gen AI. And I think that it was very empowering as a teacher to have your superintendent kind of value your voice in a way, because I know that's not always the case. And for me as a classroom level teacher, having a spot at the table to give my insights, give my perspectives, and kind of share my thoughts has been such a rewarding thing. And it's been huge for me and my confidence as an educator and as a leader, or aspiring,
Yeah,
or at least.
that's a great choice. And I completely concur with that one. All right. 3 kind of rapid fire-ish type of questions to get you out of here. And again, you're approaching a potentially really nice couple of weeks of break. So you've got that in your mind too. For your own learning, you mentioned you read all these philosophy books, but what's on the nightstand or you're listening to today that you're reading for professional growth?
For professional growth, I've read a couple AI books lately, but they're more philosophical based. The one is Nick Bostrom's Superintelligence, which talks not just about how AI and a general intelligence a vein, but actually as a superintelligence, that it becomes superior to human intelligence in every way. And just the risks associated with that, and also the pragmatic steps we need to take as a humanity to help guard against that. And also Ray Kurzweil's The Singularity is Near. I just finished that one up as well. So it's providing me with a lot of philosophical backdrop to base my insights on AI on. So I've appreciated those 2 books, and they're pretty heavy. I had to use the little dictionary quite a bit when I was reading Nick Bostrom's Superintelligence, but there's so much, they're very rewarding to help really position my thinking and provide clarity.
So any bit I've heard or read about superintelligence is never good. Is there any way in which this could maybe good or no?
Honestly, what he speaks to is it has infinite potential to really solve a lot of our existential risks to humanity, our existential threats, whether it's something like climate change or something about a pandemic. Like it can do so much if we embed these kind of guardrails in it. If it is to come to be, it is to come to pass, this technology. So there is hope that it could actually help us overcome our existential threats, or it could become one in and of itself.
Okay.
There's a few chapters dedicated to that. So it might have increased my paranoia as it did mine.
Like I said, most of what I read is not usually good. So I was hoping maybe there's something in there because I have to check my bias, because my bias is to find an optimistic perspective with all of this work, but that's sometimes not the reality of it. So anyway, what about, again, you can't read those kind of books all day long. You need some cognitive offloading. So when you do cognitive offloading, maybe it comes in the form of binge watching things that do not require a great deal of your brain power, or maybe don't. But I'm always curious if you have those, because I selfishly ask this question because I'm always looking for new movies and or series to watch.
Honestly, I just finished up The Rings of Power season 2. And I loved it. It's a continuation of kind of the Lord of the Rings world. And there's no mention of AI, which I like. There's no super intelligence. It's not like Westworld. So I found that to be a fantastic kind of just an escape
Yeah.
All the stresses of life, the stresses of AI for that matter. There's no technology in Lord of the Rings, just swords and
Good.
well, fighting and elves. So yeah.
All right. And the last question that I ask is Summerland, the whole Okanagan Valley is a beautiful spot. People go and do all kinds of things there, but I'm always looking for a hidden treasure, a place that maybe isn't the most obvious place for people to come and visit, but what's a hidden gem in that area that you would point to, whether it's a restaurant, a park, a hike, whatever, just a spot you think is kind of pretty special.
Summerland's pretty small, so almost everything is a hidden gem here. But there's a many place I love to go to. Dirty Laundry, which is a winery and a pizzeria essentially. That's a great place. I love the True Grain Bakehouse, which is a bakery just down the street from my school. So when I'm especially stressed, sometimes I go buy 4 cinnamon buns and eat 3 of them and share one with a colleague. Yeah, so there's at Summerlin. I love teaching in a small town. Everything feels so quaint and relaxed and such.
Nice, nice. Listen, Marcus, I appreciate your time. I appreciate all the work that you've done and the times you've given of yourself to whether it's teach my class or share with a larger community or give presentations. And I know you're very gracious with your time, but I also know you're a classroom teacher that has a lot on your plate, as well as taking on leadership roles within the districts. I am truly appreciative of it. I wish you the best, and I know we'll continue talking and learning with and from each other.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Dean. It was fantastic talking to you today.
You bet. Cheers.